This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Heather.
And I'm Susan.
And we're in the book of 1 Kings. Welcome to the club. Last time in chapter 7, Solomon furnished the temple just like Moses had furnished the tabernacle. The difference between the tabernacle and temple was that everything in the temple was bigger, more elaborate, and much more expensive. In fact, the interior of the temple was covered with gold. The courtyard was filled with bronze items, including a basin with over 11,000 gallons of water. That is one big swimming pool. The purpose of the temple was the same as that of the tabernacle. It was a sacred place for God and a visible reminder of the covenant with God.
So the temple's complete and Solomon is ready to dedicate it. So I imagine with great trepidation and solemnity, the Israelites gather and they probably all had one question on their mind. We have built it. Will he come? Scene 1. The ark, the cloud, and the presence of the Lord.
Chapter 8. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month.
So the temple move-in celebration took place in the 7th month. Now the temple was completed in the 8th month, we know, so it's now 11 months later. And the month of Ethanim was later known as Tishri and correlated with September, October. The festival they celebrated in conjunction with, you hear that thunder, people? The Lord is here. The festival they celebrated in conjunction with the temple dedication was the Feast of Tabernacles. So Solomon kind of waited a few months here to time the dedication with this feast. Now, this feast is one of the 9 feasts and festivals we covered in Leviticus, and I'm going to put it in the show notes, the chart of all the feasts and festivals, so you can glance over them and understand them all. The Feast of the Tabernacles was also known as the Feast of Booths, and it commemorated the 40 years the Israelites spent in the wilderness. So the people every year to commemorate the wilderness would gather in Jerusalem and set up booths or temporary shelters for a week to remind themselves and their children how the Israelites lived for 40 years in the wilderness. So it makes sense that Solomon waited until this festival to dedicate the temple, because the temple was a visible sign that Israel had found rest and permanence in the promised land. And all of the people would already be gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the feast, and they could also celebrate the temple and see it for the first time.
Continuing in verse 3, when all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord, and the tent of meeting, and all of the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place, and they are still there today. There was nothing in the ark except 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt.
So the first thing Solomon did was to install the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. And I can imagine this was not a big celebration because they did not have good experience with this in the past. Remember, people have died from moving this Ark. The last time it was moved, David moved the Ark from Obed-Edom's house to Jerusalem. So it was actually already in Jerusalem. They just had to get it in the temple. And that was very serious business. Solomon also moved all the other items that had been in the tabernacle, like, the altar and different things like that, to the temple. The temple had been at Gibeon, so that would have been a bigger move, but it's all there already. The priests placed the ark in the most holy place of the temple, beneath those 15-foot cherubim, whose outer wings touched the walls and whose inner wings met in the middle of the most holy place. The ark went right under the middle of those wings. Now, it sounds as if the poles were longer than the veil and stuck out somehow. No one is quite sure how, but they did, and it was important to the author, so it's in here.
Now, it said that it's still there today, but it's really not still there today, right? That was just when they were writing it.
Yes, that's exactly. For the author, it was still there today. The ark's inventory includes the stone tablets, but no mention is made of Aaron's staff and the pot of manna, which usually is supposed to be in the ark. So I don't know why either about that.
Verse 10, when the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever.
So once the ark was in place and the priests were out of the temple, the cloud filled the temple. I do not know if they expected this. I don't know what they were thinking. So I don't know if they were surprised, shocked, awed, terrified. It does not say. But the cloud, you will remember, we have read about in detail from past episodes. It is the glory of the Lord and embodies his presence, power, and protection. The cloud is a visible representation of the Lord's glory while at the same time covering God's glory. It reveals and it conceals. No one can look upon the full glory of God in this world or they die. And so that's why the cloud kind of conceals it. His glory is a mystery, an unimaginable greatness that our finite minds cannot grasp and our imperfect eyes cannot look upon. Remember, Moses, it passed him while he hid in the cleft of a rock. So we met the cloud often in our journey through the Old Testament. The first mention was in Exodus 13:21, in which the cloud guided the Israelites through the wilderness.
Exodus 13, starting in verse 21, by day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people.
So the cloud guided them, and then in Exodus 14, the Israelites witnessed the cloud's power and protection when it stood between them and Pharaoh's army.
Verse 19, then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long.
So the cloud defended them against the Egyptians. The cloud is strange to us. It wasn't to them. We know from 13:21 that the Lord is in the cloud. It appears that the angel of God works with the Lord in the cloud. And just as Moses said, he, God, will fight for Israel. So the cloud and angel are standing between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The separation stopped the Egyptians from attacking and blocked the Israelites' view of the Egyptians so they could focus on God. The cloud provided light to one camp and darkness to the other camp. The darkness should have been assigned to the Egyptians. They experienced darkness just days earlier, and that darkness was followed by the death of the firstborn. So they should have seen it as premonition. The cloud with two sides is another cool picture of the divine nature of God that appears frequently in both the Old and New Testaments. Darkness representing judgment and light representing salvation. So from that time forward, for 40 years, the Israelites followed the cloud. In Exodus 40, we read about the daily relationship of the cloud and the Israelites in guiding them through that wilderness.
Exodus 40, starting in verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels.
So the cloud fills the temple, and this would have been the first time this generation saw the cloud. So this would have been a drop to your knees kind of moment.
Was it also kind of like they've heard about it all their lives,
Right.
like it's folklore almost, but now they're actually seeing it.
Yeah. And I'm going to cover this, but there's like over 100,000 people there. So it would have been amazing. Okay, back to our story. So as I said, in this scene at the temple's dedication, the return of this cloud filling the temple would have been a deeply moving experience for Solomon and for all of Israel. The cloud was back, and God was pleased and had chosen to dwell among them in the temple. Now, the temple was as close as they could get to heaven on earth. God's presence, power, and protection meant peace in Israel because, as Solomon had said, God has a place for you to dwell forever among them. Scene 2, Solomon's praise for what God has done for Israel.
Back to our story in 1 Kings 8, continuing in verse 14. While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. Then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David. For he said, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built, so that my name might be there. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, you did well to have it in your heart to build a temple for my name. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, your own flesh and blood. He is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David, my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of Egypt.
So Solomon is just stating to the people the facts of what God has done for the nation. God has kept his promise to David. The temple had been built on the ground David purchased by his son Solomon, just as God promised. This was an essential spiritual accomplishment. From this time forward, the temple is central to Israel. It is visible proof of the establishment of the promised kingdom in the promised land for God's chosen people. In scene 3, Solomon prays.
Verse 22, Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said.
All right, so Solomon prays in front of the whole assembly, which meant he was not in the temple. He was most likely at the bronze altar in the outer courtyard where all the people could gather, because people were not allowed in the temple. Only priests were.
And here is what Solomon said, continuing in verse 23. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it as it is today.
So I love this. First, Solomon praises God for his covenant of love. I don't think we've heard covenant of love before. The covenant of love mentioned here means actually a covenant of Hesed, and we have discussed Hesed before. God's keeping of his covenant is an act of Hesed, and Hesed is a kindness performed for the benefit of a person in real and desperate need in the context of a deep and enduring commitment between the two people. In this case, God is in the greater position to meet the needs of his people and offers his covenant of love, loyalty, and kindness to the Israelites. And Solomon praises God for this. He praises him for his mercy in choosing to do this act of Hesed for Israel.
Verse 25, Now, Lord, the God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, the promises you made to him when you said, You shall never fail to have a successor to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your descendants are careful in all they do, to walk before me faithfully as you have done. And now, God of Israel, let your word that you promised your servant David, my father, come true.
Solomon asked God to keep another promise. He prays that God will keep his promises to David, the promise that there would always be a descendant of David's on the throne.
Verse 27, But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built?
While the temple was incredibly important to them, Solomon acknowledges that God cannot be contained or limited to this temple that he built here on this earth. And the Apostle Luke affirms this for us in Acts 7. Listen.
Acts 7, verse 44. Our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. It had been made as God directed Moses, according to the pattern he had seen. After receiving the tabernacle, our ancestors, under Joshua, brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. However, the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. As the prophet Isaiah says, Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or, where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things?
So Luke speaks here in the New Testament of the tabernacle and the temple, but declares that the Lord does not live in houses made by humans. Heaven is the Lord's throne and the earth is his footstool, is what Isaiah said. So there you have it. 3 people saying it's not the church building. It's not the temple. It's not the tabernacle. People cannot build a container for the Lord. He's not a genie in a bottle.
Now back to our story in 1 Kings 8, continuing in verse 28, Solomon's prayer. Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. Hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive.
Solomon asked God 5 times in that one paragraph to hear the prayers of Israel. And then Solomon's going to list 7 scenarios in which Israel may need God to hear their prayers and forgive them. The first is for God to hear prayers when a person wrongs a neighbor.
Verse 31, when anyone wrongs their neighbor and is required to take an oath and they come and swear the oath before your altar in this temple, then hear from heaven and act. Judge between your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing down on their heads what they have done, and vindicating the innocent by treating them in accordance with their innocence.
The second thing Solomon prays for is for God to hear prayers when Israel suffers defeat by an enemy because they have turned away from God.
Verse 33, when your people Israel have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you, and when they turn back to you and give praise to your name, praying and making supplication to you in this temple, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of the people Israel and bring them back to the land you gave their ancestors.
The third is for God to hear prayers when Israel experiences a drought because they have turned away from God.
Verse 35, when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you, and when they pray toward this place and give praise to your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them the right way to live and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance.
The fourth is for God to hear prayers when Israel experiences any disaster because they have turned away from God. 3 in a row, because they have turned away from God. You think he knows these fickle people?
And us. Verse 37, when famine or plague comes to the land, or blight or mildew, locusts or grasshoppers, or when an enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever the disaster or disease may come, and when a prayer or plea is made by anyone among your people Israel, being aware of the afflictions of their own hearts, and spreading out their hands toward this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place, forgive and act, deal with everyone according to all they do, since you know their hearts, for you alone know every human heart, so that they will fear you all the time they live in the land you gave our ancestors.
The fifth is for God to hear prayers for the foreigner who believes in God. This is like the Gentiles. I love this one.
Verse 41, as for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when they come and pray toward this temple. Then hear from heaven, your dwelling place. Do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name.
I love this because in the next episode, we're going to read about Sheba, who was one of those foreigners who came. All right, the sixth is for God to hear the prayers for victory in war.
Verse 44, when your people go to war against their enemies, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause.
The seventh is for God to hear the prayers when the people are taken captive because of their sin against God. Maybe a premonition.
Verse 46, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to their enemies, who take them captive to their own lands, far away or near, and if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent, and plead with you in the land of their captors, and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, we have acted wickedly, and if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul, in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their ancestors, toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Forgive all the offenses they have committed against you, and cause their captors to show them mercy. For they are your people and your inheritance, whom you brought out of Egypt, out of that iron smelting furnace. May your eyes be open to your servant's plea, and to the plea of your people Israel. And may you listen to them whenever they cry out to you, for you singled them out from all the nations of the world to be your own inheritance, just as you declared through your servant Moses when you, sovereign Lord, brought our ancestors out of Egypt.
Solomon prayed for the people with great wisdom. He was not ignorant of their history of sin and rebellion. He ends his prayer once more begging God to hear them whenever they cry out to him. He acknowledges that everyone sins, so he knows there's going to be mistakes, and he's hoping that they are going to cry out for them. Solomon's focus is on forgiveness because forgiveness is the key to their relationship with God. And the purpose of the covenant, the temple, and the nation is for Israel to be God's people and live in a relationship. Not a perfect relationship, like in the Garden of Eden, but an imperfect covenantal relationship until the new covenant came. The covenant we benefit from in the New Testament, where the perfect king, the one who, as Revelations 3 puts it, is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. The key of David is held by Jesus Christ, and only he has the key to an eternal relationship with God. Scene 4, Solomon's blessing and exhortation.
Verse 54, when Solomon had finished all these prayers and supplications to the Lord, he rose from before the altar of the Lord, where he had been kneeling with his hands spread out towards heaven. He stood and blessed the whole assembly of Israel in a loud voice, saying, Praise be to the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us nor forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him, to walk in obedience to him and keep the commands, decrees, and laws he gave our ancestors. And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel according to each day's need, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and that there is no other. And may your hearts be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands as at this time.
Solomon gets it. Solomon blesses the people and closed his prayer with praise to God for fulfilling his promises, prayer for God to be with them always, prayer that God would turn their hearts always to him, that they would obey God and keep his laws, and that all the words he spoke would be ever before the Lord, so that God would uphold their cause, and so that all the people of the earth would know that the Lord is the one true God of heaven and earth. This day, this celebration, this temple was a big deal, and Solomon was deeply moved. The temple was a long-awaited desire of David's and a dream of Israel's. It represented permanence, standing among the other cultures, and a future for the nation. It was costly and it was beautiful. So much more beautiful than the tabernacle. The Israelites could not begin to fathom that this beautiful new temple was nothing compared to what was to come. In fact, no one had any idea until the Apostle John, alone and in exile on the island of Patmos, had a vision of what was to come, a vision more beautiful than the tabernacle and the temple put together. A vision that merged both man-made structures, the tabernacle and the temple, with the Garden of Eden into something more glorious. A new heaven and a new earth. A place where there is no temple because God dwells among his people. What the Apostle John saw, he wrote of in the book of Revelations.
Revelations chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. The angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of the lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever.
So from the Garden of Eden to the tabernacle to the temple to this vision John has is what we're talking about here. God's plan began in the Garden of Eden with two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God's plan ends in the Apostle John's vision with this one tree, or possibly trees, some believe, lining both sides of the river. But the point is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is gone. The tree or trees in John's vision are for healing the nations. There is no curse anymore. Most importantly, there was no separation from God. The tabernacle and the temple were temporary ways that God could dwell among his people. His plan was always for something more permanent, something eternal, something beautiful beyond all we could imagine. God's plan will end in a city where we dwell with him and eat for eternity from the tree of life.
And God's plan is perfect. And we promise that this was not us just being cheesy, putting in the thunder and rain to the episode. God showed up with the sound effects today. What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.